Turkish prisoners of war in Famagusta.
So I'm going to be discussing about the Turkish prisoners of war, which were held in Famagusta in Cyprus, and an organisation created by Turkish Cypriots to free them and return Cyprus back to Turkey. I'm just going to go briefly into the background and the legal perspective of Cyprus and whether it actually belongs to Turkey or within the Ottoman Empire. So at the time, there was the Russian-Turkish War, and that took a lot out of the Ottoman Empire. This scared the British, so they meted with the Sultan of the time, Sultan Abdulhamid II, and they came up with the Cyprus Convention. In this convention, they agreed that Cyprus would be used by the British, so that administration would be handed over to the British and their forces would be able to be there, just as a protection so that Russia could not gain access to the Mediterranean Sea. Now, what we need to take into account is that the Ottoman Empire, and later on the Turkish Republic, has never turned its back on the Turkish Cypriots or Cyprus. And from a legal perspective as well, Abdulhamid II has actually in the Cyprus Convention mentioned, I'm going to read from the Ottoman Turkish here, hukuki şahanime asla halel gelmemek şartıyla muahedenameyi tasdik edelim. So in English, that would translate into, I have ratified this treaty under the condition that the law of the Book of Shahs may never be absent, which means the Sultan's rule will never end. Now, conveniently, the British didn't put this in their English translation. So from a legal perspective, we now understand where the Ottomans' perspective was in terms of the legal ownership of the island. Now, initially when the British came, this was a big shock and insult to the Turks of the island, and what is rarely mentioned in books is that in towns of Limassol, Famagusta, in Limassol and Famagusta there was Turkish resistance, physical resistance, and the British actually shot at them. So there's many Turkish Cypriots who were martyred from day one. And this is the time, again, remember that Cyprus is still a territory of the Ottoman Empire in 1878. After that brief incident, however, the general consensus of the Turkish Cypriots was that the British would be there temporarily, the island is still Ottoman, and in fact part of the Cyprus Convention mentions that the British had to pay the debt that Cyprus owed to the Ottoman Empire. And this was generally seen as jizya. So for those of you who are not familiar with Islamic terminology, jizya is a tax imposed on non-Muslim subjects. And the British were paying this. So once again, it solidifies the idea of the status of the British in the island as subjects of the Ottomans in the perspective of the Turks of the island. In reality, the British themselves were unsure of the status that they had in the island and how much power they had in the administration of the island as well. However, with the outbreak of World War I in 1914, the British used this as a pretext to turn Cyprus militarily as a British colony. So again, please remember the Cyprus Convention and what Abdulhamid had mentioned. So this action in itself is illegal. Now, what this had an effect was it built the Greek nationalism. Now, Greek nationalism was really developing at this point due to the Greek independence in 1813. And the Greek people at the time had a new ideology called the Megali Ideia, which means the great ideology. And what this ideology proposed was for a new Byzantine empire. So a great Hellenic empire, which would have territory which was traditionally in Greek-speaking lands. And the Turks of Turkey are well known with what happened with Izmir and how Mustafa Kemal Pasha, later known as Atatürk, with his forces drove them out. So all of these lands were seen, and including Cyprus, were part of the Megali Ideia, the new Hellenic empire, and the return of these lands to the Greek proper was known as enosis, which literally means union in Greek language. And to further cement this idea, in 1878, so when the British first came, the Bishop of Kitium, Kyprianos, and at the time the bishop was the leader of that community. And this was a system, again, which the Ottomans brought through the millet system. And what he said on their arrival is quite interesting. He addressed Sir Garnet Moresby upon his arrival in Larnaca on the 22nd of July 1878. We Greeks accept the change of the government because we believe that Great Britain will eventually help Cyprus, just like with the Ionian Islands, unite Cyprus with Mother Greece. Now, as a side note, I just want to remind you all, when the Ottomans did come to Cyprus in 1571, the Greeks were previously slaves, in effect, of the Catholics, the Franks, and the Lusignans, and later the Greeks. So the Ottomans freed them, and the Greeks actually helped in the process for the Ottomans to take the island. So this is the thanks we got. So it's good to keep that in mind as well. Because of the millet system, the Greeks had a head start. So the Turks, or the Muslims of the Ottoman Empire, were ruled directly from the Sultan in Istanbul, whilst other communities had autonomy within their certain areas. So the Greeks, in effect, had their organisational structure already in place for them. The Turks did not have this. They had to start from scratch. As this ideology developed, in 1912 to 1914, and again it's important to remember that when we think of the Turkish struggle in Cyprus, it's not just 1974 or the events of Bloody Christmas in 1963, but it goes all the way back to 1912 to 1914, where 72 Turkish villages and Turkish areas in large towns were attacked by Greeks of the island. This had an effect on the Turkish nationalism in the island, because the Greeks had made it very clear for their hope for Enosis, and again as the fear of Crete, which was 1/4 Turkish Muslim. The Turks of the island were totally displaced or massacred, and the remnants of the buildings there were wiped out. So this was a great concern, and Rauf Denktaş, our national leader, also mentioned Crete many times as well, in our fear of having the same fate as Crete. Now, when World War I started, many of the prisoners of war, which were taken predominantly from Çanakkale, but there were a few number from Sinai and Palestine as well, which again were Ottoman territories, were taken to what's known today as the Gülseren camp in Famagusta, which was then known as the Karakol camp. And this process began on the 23rd of October in 1916. Now these POWs, these prisoners of war, entered Cyprus with their feet chained. And the Turks of the island wanted to give a warm welcome to them. After all, the Turks were entering a Turkish land. But the Ottomans made it very clear that the area was to be cleared upon the arrival of these Turkish prisoners of war. Initially 215 came. This increased to 10,000. Now the Gülseren camp, for those of you who've done your military service in Cyprus, will know that the Gülseren camp can only accommodate for 5,400 people. So many of the prisoners of war were sleeping on the floor and were in very bad, terrible living conditions. To make things worse, the British, again in their generosity, chose to have Greek and Armenian doctors based in the camp, and these doctors made life even more difficult. To pass the time, the Turkish prisoners of war would often try and pass time. So, for example, upon eating olives, they would use the pigs to make rosary beads, what we call tesbih, or they would make wooden cigarette holders, or various small objects and gifts. And this was often given as presents of goodwill to the local Turks of the island, or sold so that they could have some pocket money in exchange. Now, when the Turks were dying, there was a high rate of deaths, so there was lots of martyrs in these camps, which was rather unusual. And there was no written record as to why this was so. Until Imam Nuri Efendi, who was the Imam of the Lala Mustafa Pasha Mosque, based in Famagusta, would do the religious burial for them. And upon going there, he had the opportunity to communicate with the soldiers. And there you notice he was informed that the British, in making their bread, were not only using flour, but they thought they would add an extra ingredient, which was sand. So this sand within the bread, upon the POWs eating it, would eventually lead to kidney and liver failure, and thus the reason for the high number of martyrs from the camp. Also, once they were initially, when the POWs were buried, they were buried in their uniform, and it was not the religious Islamic ceremony. So Imam Nuri Effendi lobbied heavily, and we have him to thank for there to be the Islamic prayer service, and for them to be adorned in the appropriate attire when being buried. This affected the Turkish Cypriots very much, so it really saddened them, and many would often cry at seeing their brethren in such conditions. Imam Nuri Effendi again is quoted as saying, "May Allah not allow anyone to be captive of the infidel. May Allah forgive the infidels." So even in these hard times we see the mercy in the hearts of the Turks of the island, even after seeing such horrendous acts. Now the duration that the POWs were held in this camp was from 1916 to 1923. This is a record breaker for World War I, because it's the longest period that any prisoner of war has been held throughout the whole conflict of World War I, and only a few survived due to the neglect, hunger and disease. Now, during this time, there was a national assembly known as the Meclis-i Milli. This was in 1918. It was held in Nicosia, and it had the elite members throughout the island get together, and this was very significant because it was the first organisation that got the Turks together, built that network up, and came up with a general consensus of what they should do as a plan. There was a first leader of the Turkish Cypriots elected, Hacı Hafız Mufti Ziauddin Effendi. This is a very significant name. Mufti Ziauddin Effendi is the first Turkish Cypriot leader of the Turkish community in Cyprus. And it's a shame that not many people in our community or elsewhere know of this name. And the agreement was, and I quote, that Cyprus is rightly in the realm of the Caliphate of Islam and the great Ottoman Sultanate, and should be returned. So all efforts from this point on by the Turkish Cypriots was to return Cyprus back into the control, effectively, into Turkey's control. Now, in this meeting, there was many important people, and his network actually helped in creating the first underground Turkish resistance movement. And this movement was called Türkiye ile Birleşme Örgütü, which translates as the Organization for Union with Turkey. It was inspired by the Turkish Liberation War. I'm just going to go through the members' names, because I do feel they all deserve the respect and our prayers. So the leaders were Dr. Hüseyin Behiç, Dr. Mehmet Esat, who is interestingly the son-in-law of the Grand Vizier of Ottoman State, Kıbrıslı Kamil Pasha, Karabardak Hasan Efendi, the Nicosian, Ali Efendi Hüseyin Babaliki of Galeburnu, Küçük Hacı Hüseyin of Bilelye, Kenan brothers of İskele, Rashid, Kamil, Said, and Hasan Efendiler, Hasan Hüseyin the Cretan, his brother Ali Kaptan, the brother-in-law of Cretan Hasan, Ahmet Çavuş Osmancı of Limassol, his brother Osman Son Ali, Mehmet Naim Adil Efendi of Famagusta, his son Mehmet Bey, Mehmet Naim's relative Imam Mustafa Nuri Efendi, who was mentioned earlier, Mahmud Jalaluddin Efendi, Dr. Eyüp Bey of Paphos, and many other unnamed heroes. So when you get time, please, if we could do a prayer for these great heroes, and if we could remember the name Türkiye ile Birleşme Örgütü, which was prior to the Türk Mukavemet Teşkilatı, the Turkish Resistance Organization. They had a plan in which it's quite interesting actually the way they were planning to return Cyprus to Turkish control. They were planning to create disturbances in the Easter week of 1919 when there was least British soldiers on the island. Throughout the island, these disturbances would run, particularly in the towns of Nicosia, Limassol and Paphos, with the aim of distracting the attention of British authorities. Following a signal, if successful, the prisoners of war would be notified, and they would overpower the guards, seize their rifles, and break free and start a general Turkish uprising with the aim of reuniting with Turkey. If immediate unification was not possible, however, a temporary solution would be a Turkish island administration, and this was inspired by our brethren, the new Turkish state which was formed at the time, the Turkish government of Western Thrace, and also the newly created Turkish country of Azerbaijan Democratic Republic. So we have them to thank for the inspiration as well. At the very least, it would make the British think twice before even thinking of giving Cyprus over to Greece in their aims for Enosis. Unfortunately, the plan was discovered when a matchbox was thrown into the camp, containing a secret letter instructing the prisoners to go to their beds dressed in their uniform and wait for the uprising. According to Viscount Milner, in a secret dispatch sent on the 6th of May 1919, the British were given information by various sources, including Said Effendi, who was a member of the Legislative Council, as to the likelihood of a disturbance. So unfortunately, as with every other times in our history, there has been traitors among us who have been sold out. And as a result, the British dispatched 30 troops with machine guns in the Turkish quarter of Nicosia. So 30 troops with machine guns at the time. It really says how scared the British were of the Turkish uprising. I think that's really significant. It should really make us proud as Turks of the island. The leading members of the Türkiye Birleşme Örgütü were Dr. Esad, Dr. Behic, and Hasan Karabaklar, and they were arrested under martial law. Many others who also supported the prisoners of war, all the Turkish war effort, such as Imam Huri Efendi and Baba Diki, were imprisoned by the British in the dungeons of the Korinya Castle. Their condition in the dungeons, again in typical British fashion, were bad. Baba Diki and Imam Huri Efendi died soon after being released as a result of the conditions that they were under in the Korinya Castle. And as a bit of support for them, many of the families of the imprisoned rented houses in the Korinya vicinity, and they would actually make food for their families, as and when the British allowed them to give food to the imprisoned family members. However, this was unavailable for everybody, as not everybody had the means to rent houses at the time. They were kept there until the Kenan brothers hired a famous lawyer, Musavidzadeh Osman Cemal Efendi, and they were soon after released as a result. As for the POWs, all of the officers were killed by the British. The plan, which was described by the Colonial Office as a pro-Turkish or pan-Islamic agitation. Now, that was the plan, and it did come very close to coming into fruition. I'm going to give a few of the examples of the fate of the main ringleaders. After Dr. Mehmet Esad was released from the Korinya Castle, in a secret dispatch sent by High Commissioner of Cyprus, Malcolm Stevenson, to the Secretary of State to the colonies, confirming the repatriation of Dr. Esad and his family to Istanbul. So they were sent to Istanbul away from Cyprus. Dr. Hussein Behic, after being released, he fell victim to a conspiracy by the British. And it's really, really sad, and I just want to go into a bit of detail regarding what happened to Dr. Behic and his wife, Fatma Hanım. Agents of the British intelligence secretly told Fatma Hanım that her husband frequented a certain brothel and could be found on a particular day. And these are all lies. And likewise, Dr. Behic was told that his wife solicited at this certain brothel. So naturally, they both went to find out what's going on. Is it true that my wife is soliciting in this brothel? Is it true that my husband is frequenting brothels? And when they went there, they met each other there. Dr. Hussein Behic was so angered that he didn't even question what his wife was doing there. He got his gun out and shot her dead there and then. And as a result, the British convicted Dr. Behic for murder and was executed by hanging. Hasan Karabaklar, after his release of Korinya, it's not all bad news, went on to gather financial support from Turkish Cypriots and also volunteers in Cyprus, and he went on to support the Turkish War of Independence, Kurtuluş Savaşı. So a bit of, a piece of pride for us there as the Turks of the island. And I just want to finish off with a story from one of the members, Ahmet Sadrazam, and the 3 Turkish POWs. So 3 of the Turkish prisoners of war actually escaped from the Gülseren camp, the Karakol camp, and were hoping to go back to Anatolia. Now the closest point in Cyprus to Anatolia is from a village which was called Livara, which is now called Sadrazamköy. And upon going there, they met Ahmet Sadrazam, and who the village was named after. And the reason for his name being Sadrazam, which in Turkish means Grand Vizier, or because of the authority he had not only with the Turks of the area, but that area is well known as also having Maronite Arabs there as well, and there's also various Greeks that lived there as well. So this Turkish man was very influential there, hence the name Sadrazam. Fearing for their safety, Sadrazam hid the 3 POWs in a nearby cave. Slowly he brought wood and accessories to build a rowing boat, and when they got on the boat, they started on their journey, and unfortunately water seeped in, so they had to return back to Cyprus. So it's been difficult for them, to say the least. Upon returning, the local Christian and Cypriot Arabs, who are known as Maronites, spotted the men and informed the British police in the village of Çamlıbel, which was previously known as Mirtu. Upon the police hearing about this, word got out. And as Cyprus knows, one of the things that we are famous for is dedikodu rumours. So word soon got out to Ahmet Sadrazam that the British police were informed of his actions in supporting the Turkish POWs, and they would soon be coming to investigate and arrest Ahmet Sadrazam and the POWs. Upon the British coming, Ahmet Sadrazam tried to distract them, and he told the POWs to try and leave as soon as possible for Anatolia. So he was a generous host, as the Turks were known for being. Gave lots of kebab and drink to them. Unfortunately, this wasn't enough to deter the British, and they found and convicted the POWs. And before the POWs were to be executed by the British actually brought Ahmet Sadrazam was detained temporarily in the Kyrenia Castle, then brought to Nicosia, Lefkoşa, with a group of other men, and the POWs were asked, which one of these is Ahmet Sadrazam? Now, of course, they had a loyalty for this man. Not only is a Turk, but this is the man who tried to help them. And the response was, look how he is dressed. He cannot be a Sadrazam, a Grand Vizier. Our Sadrazam is in the palace in Istanbul. We don't know this man. The British officer got so furious, he stopped his foot on the floor and said to Ahmet Sadrazam, you best leave and pray that they didn't recognize you. If they had, we would hang you in the gallows. Now get out, you're free. So I'll end it with that good story there and hand over to my respected colleague, Hussein.